Hi guys. Hello, my beautiful people. Today I'm back with the Ickabog. I'm so excited. We're almost done. This thing keeps slipping. So today I'm going to be reading 48, 49, and 50. And I apologize. Every time I keep looking at the screen, I forget to look at. But I'm trying to get used to it. It just seems that no matter what, I don't. Technically, you can only get better, right? Experience is what teaches us. Okay, take the slip off. As you can see, I have a different background. The little sign that I made for my channel. Okay. Chapter 48. Bert and Daisy find each other. The chill of winter was felt in Ma Grunter's orphanage too. Children in rags who are fed only on cabbage soup cannot withstand coughs and colds as easily as children who are well fed. The little cemetery at the back of the orphanage saw a steady stream of John and James, who died for lack of food and warmth and love, and they were buried without anybody knowing their real names. Although the other children mourned them, the sudden spate of death was the reason Ma Grunter had sent Basher John out onto the streets of Jeroboam to round up as many homeless children as he could find to keep up her numbers. Inspectors came to visit 3 times a year to make sure she wasn't lying about how many children were in her care. She preferred to take in older children if possible because they were hardier than the little ones. The gold she received for each child had now made Ma Grunter's private rooms in the orphanage some of the most luxurious in Cornucopia, with a blazing fire and deep velvet armchairs, thick silk rugs, and a bed with soft woolen blankets. Her table was always provided with their finest food and wine. The starving children caught whiffs of heaven as Bernstone's pies in Kurtzburg cheeses passed into Ma Grunter's apartment. She rarely left her rooms now except to greet the inspectors, leaving Basher John to manage the children. Daisy Dovetail paid little attention to the 2 new boys when they first arrived. They were dirty and ragged as were all the newcomers. And Daisy and Martha were busy trying to keep as many of the smaller children alive as was possible. They went hungry themselves to make sure the little ones got enough to eat, and Daisy carried bruises from Basher John's cane because she often inserted herself between him and the smaller child he was trying to hit. If she thought about the new boys at all, it was to despise them for agreeing to be called John without putting up in any sort of fight. She wasn't to know that it suited the 2 boys very well for nobody to know their real names. A week after Bert and Roderick arrived at the orphanage, Daisy and her best friend Martha birthday party for the Eddie Hopkins twins. Many of the youngest children didn't know when their birthdays were, so Daisy picked a date for them and always made sure it was celebrated, if only with a double portion of cabbage soup. She and Martha always encouraged the little ones to remember their real names too, although they taught them to call one another John and Jane in front of Basher John. Daisy had a special treat for the twins. She'd actually managed to steal 2 real Jokesville pastries from the delivery for Ma Grunters several days before and saved them for the twins' birthday. Even though the smell of pastries had tortured Daisy, it had been hard to resist eating them herself. "Oh, it's lovely," sighed the little girl through tears of joy. "Lovely," echoed her brother. "Those came from Jokesville, which is the capital," Daisy told them. She tried to teach the smaller children things she remembered from her own interrupted school days, and often described the cities they'd never seen. Martha liked hearing about Kurtzburg, Baronstowns, and Showsville too, because she never lived anywhere but the marshlands and Ma Grunter's orphanage. The twins had just swallowed the last crumbs of their pastries when Basher John came bursting into the room. Daisy tried to hide the plate on which was trays of cream, but Basher John had spotted it. "You," he bellowed, approaching Daisy with the cane held up over his head, "have been stealing again, ugly Jane." He was about to bring it down on her when he suddenly found it, caught in midair. Bert had heard the shouting and gone to find out what was going on. Seeing that Basher John had cornered a skinny girl in much patch coveralls, Bert grabbed and held the cane on the way down. "Don't you dare," Bert told Basher John in a low growl. For the first time, Daisy heard the new boy's Jokesville accent, but he looked so different to Bert she'd once known. So much older, so much harder faced that she didn't recognize him. As for Bert, who remembered Daisy as a little olive-skinned girl with brown pigtails, he had no idea he'd ever met the girl with a burning eyes before. Basher John tried to pull his cane free of Bert's grip, but Roderick came to Bert's aid. There was a short fight, and for the first time in any of the children's memories, Basher John lost. Finally, vowing revenge, he left the room with a cut lip and his sword spread in whispers around the orphanage that the 2 new boys had rescued Daisy and the twins, and that Basher John had slunk off looking stupid. Later that evening, all the orphanage children were settling down for bed. Bert and Daisy passed each other on the upstairs landing, and they paused a little awkwardly to talk to each other. "Thank you very much," said Daisy, "for earlier." "You're welcome," said Bert. "Does he often behave like that?" "Quite often," said Daisy with a little shrug. "But the twins got their pastries. I'm very grateful." Bert now thought he saw something familiar in the shape of Daisy's face and heard the trace of Joseville in her voice. Then he looked down at the ancient, much watch coveralls onto which Daisy had to sew extra length to the legs. "What's your name?" he asked. Daisy glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Daisy," she said, "but you must remember to call me Jane when Basher John's around." "Daisy," gasped Bert. "Daisy, it's me, Bert Beamish." Daisy's mouth fell open, and before she knew it, they were hugging and crying as though they've been transformed back into small children in those sunlit days in the palace courtyard before Daisy's mother had died and Bert's father had been killed, when Cornucopia had seemed the happiest place on earth. Chapter 49. Escape from Ma Grunter's. Children generally stayed at Ma Grunter's orphanage until she threw them out and onto the street. She received no gold for looking after grown men and women, and had allowed Bastard John to stay only because he was useful to her. While they were still worth gold, Ma Grunter made sure no children escaped by keeping all doors securely locked and bolted. Only Bastard John had keys, and the last boys who tried to steal them had spent months recovering from his injuries. Daisy and Martha both knew the time was coming when they'd be thrown out, but they were less worried for themselves than for what would become of the little ones once they were gone. Bert and Roderick knew they'd have to leave around the same time, if not sooner. They weren't able to check and see whether wanted posters with Bert's face on them were still stuck on the walls of Jeroboam, but it seemed unlikely they'd been taken down. The four lived in a daily dread that Ma Grunter and Bastard John would realize they had a valuable fugitive worth 100 gold ducats under their roof. In the meantime, Bert, Daisy, Martha, and Roderick met every night while the other children were asleep to share their stories and pool their knowledge about what was going on in Cornucopia. They held these meetings in the only place Bastard John never went, the large cabbage cupboard in the kitchen. Roderick, who'd been raised to make jokes about the marshlands, laughed at Martha's accent during the first of these meetings, but Daisy told him off so fiercely that he didn't do it again. Huddled around the single candle as though it were a fire, amid mountains of tough, smelly cabbages, Daisy told the boys about her kidnap, where Bert shared his fear that his father had died in some kind of accident, and explained about the way the Darkfooters faked attacks on towns to keep people believing in the Ickabog. He also told the others about how the mail was intercepted, how the two lords were stealing wagon loads of gold from the country, and that the hundreds of people had been killed, or if they were useful to Spittleworth in some way, imprisoned. However, each of the boys was hiding something, and I'll tell you what it was. Roderick suspected that Mr. Beamish had been accidentally shot in the marsh all those years ago, but he hadn't told Bert that because he was scared his friend would blame him for not telling him sooner. Meanwhile, Bert, who was certain Mr. Dovetail had carved the giant feet the Darkfooters were using, didn't tell Daisy so. You see, he was certain Mr. Dovetail must have been killed after making them. He didn't want to give Daisy false hope that he was still alive. As Roderick didn't know who carved the many sets of feet used by the Darkfooters, Daisy had no idea about her father's part in the attacks. But what about the soldiers? Daisy asked Roderick. On the 6th night, they met in the cabbage cupboard. The Ickabog Defense Brigade and the Royal Guard. Are they in on it? I think they must be. A bit, said Roderick, but only the very top people know everything. The two lords and whoever's replaced my father. He fell silent for a while. The soldiers must know there is no Ickabog, said Bert, after all the time they've spent in the marshlands. There is an Ickabog, though, said Martha. Rhodey didn't laugh, though he might have done it if he'd just met her. Daisy ignored Martha as she usually did, but Bert said kindly, I believe in it myself until I realized what was really going on. The foursome went off to bed that night, agreeing to meet again the following evening. Each was burning with ambition to save the country, but they kept coming back to the fact that without weapons, they could hardly fight Spilworth and his many soldiers. However, when the girls arrived in the cabbage cupboard on the seventh night, Bert knew from their expressions that something bad had happened. Trouble, whispered Daisy as soon as Martha had closed the cupboard door. We heard Matt Grunter and Basher John talking just before we went to bed. There's an orphanage inspector on the way. He'll be here tomorrow afternoon. The boys looked at each other extremely worried. The last thing they wanted was for an outsider to recognize them as two fugitives. We have to leave, said Bert and Roderick. Now, tonight, together, we can manage to get the keys from Basher John. I'm game, said Roderick, clenching his fist. Well, Martha and I are coming with you, said Daisy. We've thought of a plan. What plan? Asked Bert. I say the four of us head north to the soldiers' camp in the marshlands, said Daisy. Martha knows the way. She can guide us. When we went there, we tell the soldiers everything Roderick told us about the Ickabog being fake. It's real though, said Martha, but the other three ignored her. And about the killings and all the gold Spittlesworth and Flaboon are stealing from the country. We can take on Spittlesworth alone. There must be some good soldiers who'd stop obeying him and help us take the country back. It's a good plan, said Bert slowly, but I don't think you girls should come. It might be dangerous. Roderick and I will do it. No, Bert, said Daisy, her eyes almost feverish. With four of us, we double the number of soldiers we can talk to. Please don't argue unless something changes soon. Most of the children in this orphanage will be in that cemetery before the winter's over. I took a little more argument for Bert to agree that the two girls should come because he privately worried that Daisy and Martha were too frail to make the journey. But the last he agreed. All right, you better grab your blankets off your beds because it's going to be a long, cold walk. Rhodey and I will deal with Basher John. So Bert and Roderick sneaked into Basher John's room. The fight was short and brutal. It was lucky Matt Grunter had drunk 2 whole bottles of wine with her dinner because otherwise all the banging and shouting would definitely have woken her. Leaving Basher John bloody and bruised, Roderick stole his boots. Then he locked him in his own room, and the 2 boys sprinted to join the girls who were waiting beside the front door. It took 5 long minutes to unfasten all the padlocks and loosen all the chains. A blast of icy air met them as they opened the door with one last glance back at the orphanage. Threadbare blankets around their shoulders, Daisy and Bert, Martha and Roderick slipped out onto the streets and set off to the marshlands through the first few flakes of snow. Chapter 50. A Winter's Journey. No harder journey had been made in all Cornucopia's history than the trek of those 4 young people to the marshlands. It was the bitterest winter the kingdom had seen for 100 years, and by the time the dark outline of Jeroboam had vanished behind them, the snow was falling so thickly it dazzled their eyes with whiteness. Their thin, patched clothes and their torn blankets were no match for the freezing air, which bit at every part of them like tiny sharp-toothed wolves. If not for Martha, it would have been impossible to find their way, but she was familiar with the country north of Jeroboam, and in spite of the thick snow now covering every landmark, she recognized old trees she used to climb, odd-shaped rocks that had always been there, and a ramshackle once belonged to neighbors, even though Even so, the farther north they traveled, the more all of them wondered if their hearts whether the journey would kill them, though they never spoke that though out loud. Each felt their body plead with them to stop, to lie down in the icy straw in some abandoned barn and give up. On the third night, Martha knew they were close because she could smell the familiar ooze and brackish water of the marsh. All of them regained a little hope. They strained their eyes for any sign of torches and fires in the soldiers' encampment and imagined they heard men talking and jingling of harnesses through the whistling wind. Every now and then they saw a glint in their distance or heard a noise, but it was always just a moonlight reflecting on frozen puddle or a tree creaking in the blizzard. At last they reached the edge of the wide expanse of rock marsh and rustling weed that they realized they were no soldiers there at all. The winter storms had caused to retreat. The commander, who was privately certain there was no Ickabog, had decided that he wasn't going to let his men freeze to death just to please the Lord Spittleworth, so he'd given the other to head south. And if it hadn't been for a thick snow, which was still falling so fast it covered all tracks, the friends might have been able to see the soldiers' 5-day-old footprints going in the opposite direction. Look, said Roderick, pointing as he shivered. They were here. A wagon had been abandoned in the snow because it had been stuck, and the soldiers wanted it to escape the storm quickly. The foursome approached the wagon and saw food such as Bert, Daisy, and Roderick remembered only from their dreams, in which Martha had never seen in her life. Heaps of creamy curds, burnt cheeses, piles of Joesville pastries, sausages, and venison pies of Barestone, all sent to keep the camp commander and his soldiers happy. Because there was no food to be had in the marshlands, Bert reached out numb fingers to try to take a pie, but a thick layer of ice now covered the food, and his fingers simply slid off. He turned a hopeless face to Daisy, Martha, and Roderick, although whose lips were now blue. Nobody said anything. They knew they were going to die of cold on the edge of the Ickabog marsh, and none of them really cared any longer. Daisy was so cold that to sleep forever seemed a wonderful idea. She barely felt an added chill as she sank slowly into the snow. Bert sank down and put his arms around her, but he too was feeling sleepy and strange. Martha leaned up against Roderick, who tried to draw her under his blanket, huddled together beside the wagon. All four were soon unconscious, and the snow crept up their bodies as the moon began to rise, and then a vast shadow rippled over them. Two enormous arms covered in long green hair, like marshweed, descended upon the four friends as easily as they were babies. The Ickabog had scooped them up and bore them away across the marsh. So here we have it. The Ickabog is real. Finally, it's revealed. So, we don't have that much left, yay. So, that's interesting, very interesting. They were about to die, and he took them in. So, let's see what happens in the next 3 chapters. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're enjoying this story of the Ickabog. thumbs up, share, comment. Don't forget to subscribe to my Instagrams, both of them. And I will talk to you. Oh, and I want to apologize for any burping sound. I just filmed a video and I was drinking soda. And I don't really drink soda, but obviously the gases have to come up. So I apologize for the sounds. But thank you so much. And I will talk to you in my next video.